Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. You know, I was quite relieved this afternoon when I made to come down here. I woke up in the morning, I looked at a window, and I could barely see the next house next to mine because it was so foggy. And I was like, okay, there we go again. So what's going to happen today? Is it coming or it's not coming? But then I was reassured because I knew that he was somewhere in Bloomington already. So he's not flying, he can drive. So I was very happy to, when I came down here, Paula called me and said, they are here, they talk about the come get us. Like, thank you. So this is happening. So I'm really very happy. And on behalf of our collective service, I thank Patrick, the Dean, of course, and our guest speaker. Because as you know, we were supposed to have this sometime last October. It didn't happen. And I thank you, particularly the students, for bearing with us and showing up as you have. So look forward to a very good and interesting evening. Now, who is this gentleman that we're about to hear from today? Who is Mr. Lewis? Stephen Lewis is a humanitarian who has worked to improve the human condition both at home and abroad. Leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party for 8 years, during which time he became the leader of the official opposition, he also served as Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and as deputy executive director of UNICEF in New York. Mr. Lewis is the former UN Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa, a post he held from June 2001 to the end of 2006. In 2006, Mr. Lewis became the inaugural scholar in residence at the Institute on Globalization and the Human Condition at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He is also a senior advisor to the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in New York. Mr. Lewis is co-chair of the Leadership Program Committee for the 17th International AIDS Conference, which we held in Mexico City in August 2008. Of directors of International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. And Mr. Lewis is the chair of the board of the Stuart Lewis Foundation, which is dedicated to easing the pain of HIV/AIDS in Africa. Admired by Canadians of all political ideologies, he has garnered respect and attention internationally for the strength and eloquence with which he presents his convictions. Mr. Lewis is a companion of the Order of Canada. That's Canada's highest honor for lifetime achievement. In 2003, Maclean's magazine chose Mr. Lewis as the inaugural Canadian of the Year. In 2004, Mr. Lewis was awarded the Pearson Peace Medal by the United Nations Association in Canada, celebrating outstanding achievement in the field of international service and understanding. Mr. Lewis holds 24 honorary degrees from Canadian universities. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada and a senior fellow of Mercy College. In April 2005, Mr. Lewis was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was cited in the category which included people like the Dalai Lama, Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, and Nelson Mandela. Stephen's book, Race Against Time, received the 2005 Libris Award for Book of the Year from the Canadian Booksellers Association. The organization also honored Mr. Lewis with the Libris Award for Author of the Year. And speaking about the book, if you look behind you, you will see that Barnes & Noble has arranged for the sale of copies of Mr. Lewis's book. Feel free to stop by. I hear the price is only about $16, taxes included. And since we have Mr. Lewis here, he will honorably sign, autograph any copies of the books as you may buy. So without much ado, please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Stephen Lewis.
I'm obviously delighted to be here, and I feel as though I owe you some explanatory penance for the long delay between when I should have been here in 2006 and was subverted by a snowstorm. I'm glad finally to be in the austere environs of an athletics club. I've never spoken in such an ambiguous environment before. I am a person who regards all exercise of any kind as profoundly and inherently indecent. And therefore I'm grievously put off by the circumstances of this gathering. I'm very much taken with Raphael, who was kind enough to meet me and my very close colleague Paula Donovan as we emerged from the hotel. Raphael is a citizen of Nigeria. He is facing an election in that country in April. He will presumably be leaving shortly to campaign. I don't know whether he has presidential ambitions, but there is an opening for a presidential candidate. And after all, Chicago tends to yield presidential ambitions. And then in Canada, probably in June, there will be an election, so he can apply his citizenship immediately thereafter. God knows, Raphael, my country is in trouble. It's a minority government. It needs some visionary leadership. I'm a democratic socialist. I don't want to induce any cardiac arrests in the audience. You are a sophisticated audience. You won't mind my declaration of ideological left-wingism. In Canada, I am so passé and mainstream, it is of no consequence. In the United States, on the other hand, I'm headed for Guantanamo, and I therefore really wanted to declare to you a certain predisposition philosophically, which will inevitably infuse the remarks that I want to make. I think that the obvious context for my observations, and I'm going to feel comfortable and easygoing in these remarks because I love addressing a university audience, and although it will be a serious speechifying, I want to speak as a friend rather than as an imported guest. It occurs to me that the best context for what I'd like to say is rooted most obviously in the year 2000 and the United Nations General Assembly discussion of the Millennium Development Goals, which you will recall was a kind of antidote to the assumption of that General Assembly at the turn of the century, which was originally destined to discuss the positive attributes of globalization. But globalization, as it evolved during the 1990s, showed such abject inability to deal with human inequality and disparity in the world that there had to be a new compendium of targets to compensate for what globalization was doing. And so all of the countries gathered in the General Assembly voluntarily, universally, agreed on these 8 goals which would serve to bridge the gap, if implemented, between the developed and the developing world. And although they are predictable, they are also germane. Let me remind you of them. Number 1, to reduce the most extreme forms of poverty and hunger in half. Number 2, dramatically to reduce maternal mortality rates. It's not often recognized, even now, by knowledgeable people, that over the last 20 years, with a kind of heartbreaking, consistent continuity, over 500,000 women have died in childbirth every year, and we've never been able to reduce the number. Despite all of the knowledge about emergency obstetric intervention and midwives and moving women who are in difficulty in labor from rural hinterlands into district hospitals, we've never been able to reduce the number. So in order to make that significant reduction, maternal mortality became one of the development goals. Number 3, dramatically to reduce infant mortality. Number 4, to put every single child who was of elementary school age into primary school. It's estimated that there are roughly 115 to 120 million such kids out of school, over 60% of them girls. Number 5, to attempt to approximate a form of gender equality. The Millennium Development Goals were lousy on gender. The measure of equality is parity between boys and girls in school.
That's an unusual redefinition of gender equality, and it shows what happens when questions of gender are discussed anywhere. The dominance of men in the discussion perverts the outcome. In every case, I've never known it otherwise. And the need to achieve gender equality, because gender inequality is doing such damage to women all around the world, was therefore embraced as a target, although its definition was abjectly limited. Number 6, to turn back the pandemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Number 7, to achieve a degree of environmental sustainability. And now that there is this international preoccupation with climate change, that particular insight back in 2000 becomes clairvoyant. And number 8, to achieve a degree of partnership between the developed and the developing world such that the developed world will deliver on its promises rather than betraying them at a moment's notice. And those development goals put in place made everybody feel highly virtuous about what it was the world might achieve. And then 7 years into the period, we find that the goals may be implemented in whole or in part in various parts of the world, but they will be implemented overall, not at all, anywhere on the continent of Africa. Not a one of the 53 sub-Saharan countries of Africa, a continent I know best and will speak most about because I've loved it for 46 years and it has been my job to pursue the nature of the pandemic in Africa for the last several years. But in Africa, the Millennium Development Goals are an illusory mirage. It's not going to happen because of the combination of poverty on the one hand and the entrenched reality of the HIV and AIDS pandemic on the other. Let me tell you what lives in my mind over the last, as a result of the last few years. And let me try to draw thematically a series of disparate themes together to achieve a symmetrical whole by the time I come to the finale, and to, in the process, introduce some particular thoughts for students like yourselves. I tramped around Africa for the last 5.5 years. Paula was with me on many occasions. I'm not new to this world. I've been going back and forth from Africa since 1960. I've spent more than 15 years as an elected politician. I spent a number of years as a diplomat. I spent a number of years in multilateralism, working with UNICEF and the UN agencies. Nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for what I encountered in the period 2001 till the end of 2006. And the most difficult dimension was the prevalence of death. It was an absolute nightmare to spend so much of one's life dealing with death and to watch societies, communities, families struggling heroically, remarkably, to overcome the ferocious assault of the virus, but inevitably to succumb in huge numbers because we're dealing with such impoverishment and such desperate vulnerability. I remember quite vividly when Paula and I, on one occasion, visited the David Livingstone Public School in Harare in Zimbabwe, a grade 5 class of 10-year-olds, and a very inventive and lively teacher wanted to do a life skills class with those kids. And she suggested that she was going to hand out slips of paper to all of them on which they would write what bothered them most, what worried them most, and then she would gather up the slips of paper and drop them in a basket and pull them out one by one and discuss the contents of each. And you know children, they with furrowed and intense concentration, they wrote on the slips of paper, handed them in. 7 out of every 10 kids wrote the word death. These are 10-year-olds. Death of a mother, death of a father, death of an uncle, death of an aunt, death of a friend. The teacher asked them, what do you do in the face of such death? And they said, we pray. And she said to them, to whom do you pray? And they said, perhaps, predictably, to God. And then there followed in the class a very animated discussion about how the infection proceeds. And these kids had a most extraordinary grasp of human sexuality, which undoubtedly emerges when you're in the midst of a heterosexually transmitted pandemic. But they knew about injecting drug use, and they knew about condoms, and they knew about hazardous blood supplies, and they knew about the nature of transmission. They were quite astonishing in their grasp. And it was a very lively and informative discussion. And we walked out, and I remember saying to the teacher that the one thing I didn't understand was the references to prayer and God. And she said at the time, quite earnestly, you don't understand, Mr. Lewis, because if you went to funerals at lunchtime and funerals after school and funerals on the weekend, you would know that the only solace you had left was prayer and God. And I was reminded of being in the little NGO in Windhoek, Namibia, called Catholic AIDS Action, a wonderful NGO in the country which does a lot of networking with many of the women in particular who are living with AIDS. And when I got there, the sister who was in charge of the Catholic AIDS Action site said to me, Mr. Lewis, I want you to come out back and see our income-generating project. And I went out back of this little community center where Catholic AIDS Action was gathered, and I was confronted by a small group of young men who were making paper mache coffins for infants, about this long. And as they affixed the handles to the coffins, they said to me, Mr. Lewis, we can't keep up with the demand. And that sense of the pervasiveness of death, which has haunted so much of the continent, particularly southern and eastern Africa, for so many years, is absolutely overwhelming as one travels. And the legacy of the death, and the sense of what communities have been dealing with, and the intense emotional laceration that is a consequence of constantly dealing with death, it speaks volumes to the resilience of societies that they could handle it. I want to say honestly, I'm not at all sure that a Western or North American society could handle that degree of decimation of families and communities. It is a phenomenon in Africa, which is a society of tremendous sophistication and intelligence at the grassroots, a society which is intensely musical, used as a bond amongst peoples. Singing, dancing, drumming, drama, poetry. It's an extraordinary truth about Africa that you encounter one manifestation of the arts or another every single day of one's life. It's a unifying feature of life, and the way in which they've been able to come together to resist the depredations of the pandemic is absolutely extraordinary. In the book Race Against Time, I tell the anecdote about being out in the hinterland of Zambia with the district commissioner, who wanted in a very excited way to show me his favorite income-generating project. And we trekked down many a rural trail until we came to an open field, one half of which was a cabbage patch, and on the other half of which was assembled a group of 15 or 20 women beneath a banner which proclaimed their HIV-positive status, and they spoke to me with tremendous heat and emotion about how they felt of the men who had infected them. And then, almost in order to break the tension, I said to them, this cabbage patch, this is your income-generating project? Oh, yes, they said. And I said to them, you use the cabbages to reinforce your immune system, to make you feel better, better nutrition. You can withstand the opportunistic infections before it leads to AIDS. Oh, yes, they said, understanding all of it. And I said, do you have any cabbages left over? Oh, yeah. What do you do with them? We take them to market. Are you able to sell them all? Yes, we sell them all. What do you do with the profit? I said. And they looked at me a little perplexed, and then the leader of the group came forward and said, Well, Mr. Lewis, we buy coffins, of course. We never have enough coffins. And you have to think at that moment in time that the world is completely out of whack, that something has gone wrong in our normal perceptions of rationality. This is 2006, 2007, for God's sakes. It is almost beyond comprehension that we should have allowed a virus to take such a toll when there are ways of lessening the carnage. And those ways are not being applied. And necessarily, and this brings me to the second factor which has weighed very heavily on me, it's the stripping of human capacity. It's the extraordinary loss in the productive generations between the ages of 15 and 49 of so many of the occupational groupings, whether it's doctors or nurses or pharmacists or teachers or farmers or civil servants. It's the loss of such numbers, especially in the health field. So that even when you have the medication, even when you have the antiretroviral drugs, even when you have the drugs at a cost which can be afforded, you don't have the people to dispense the medication. I was reading just this morning an article that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, giving some insight into the loss of human capacity, and there were 3 or 4 juxtapositions which took me aback, even though I'm familiar with the subject matter. The writer was pointing out that sub-Saharan Africa has 11% of the world's population, and almost 65% of the people who are infected with AIDS, somewhere between 25 and 28 million. And it commands only 3% of the world's health workforce. In the United States of America, there is 1 doctor for every 390 people. In Mozambique, there is 1 doctor for every 33,000 people. In the United States, there is 1 nurse for every 107 citizens. In Tanzania, there is 1 nurse for every 2,700 Tanzanian citizens. There are a total of 24 pharmacists in Angola with a population of 12 million. There's a total of 100 doctors in the public sector in Malawi, 2 pediatricians in the entire public sector, in a country of between 11 and 12 million people. I have stood in the Lilongwe Central Hospital in Malawi on the night shift near midnight with 70 adult males in the adult male ward. Each and every one of them would be in intensive care in a hospital in Chicago. And there was 1 nurse on a 10-hour shift. It's a redefinition of human ingenuity, human response to adversity, the courage and determination of people that they manage to somehow keep the societies going and keeping them stitched together, because when you lose so much by way of human capacity, and when the world hasn't yet responded in a fashion which will regenerate the capacity through training and retraining and some presence of expatriates to help bridge the gap until those societies are able to function themselves, it's amazing how they cope. And I suppose the dimension, bringing me to the third aspect, which lives in my mind, about which there is such a sense of despair where I'm concerned that I can scarce convey it, is what is happening to the women of Africa. Because you've never seen gender inequality playing itself out in this way. Because in the presence of the pandemic, gender inequality is fatal. And it's desperately important for me to say, I want to say it to this group, that what we see here is the legitimate truth of the feminist analysis. That the feminist analysis has never had more force, weight, and validity than when it is measured by what is happening on the African continent in the high prevalence countries. Because that feminist analysis, which largely works on a major premise that men are so reluctant to relinquish power and authority, that so much of the world's distortion in terms of equality and in terms of social justice is distorted by male behavior and the inability to deal with power and authority, and transfer, relinquishment. The feminist analysis was never more accurate. And the absence of sexual autonomy, which exists across the continent, the simple inability to say no to predatory male sexual behavior, or to negotiate safe sex, or to say wear a condom. It is not a surprise that a number of studies more recently demonstrated that one of the riskiest environments for a woman in Africa is to be married. Because in many of the southern urban centers, there are higher prevalence rates in marriage for women than there are for sexually active women, single sexually active women in the surrounding community. Who would have thought that possible? You see, what the pandemic is throwing up are numbers of unexpected and until now absent in human catalog of human behavior, a number of themes and patterns with which we have very little familiarity. We don't know how to handle them. Women do all the work in Africa. Women do all the caring. They do it uncompensated. They do it unacknowledged. They hold the societies together. They are the repositories of the sophistication and intelligence of the continent at the grassroots. And they are being decimated in unbelievable numbers. Indeed, in your age grouping, between the 15 and 24-year-olds in Africa, where 7 or 8 million people are living with the virus, 78% of them are young women and girls, 78%. So you can see the grotesquely disproportionate numbers. I was in Mozambique, I guess about 3 months ago, or 4 months ago. I was visiting the second largest city in the country, Beira, second only to the capital of Maputo. It is the big port, the transportation routes flow out from Beira into the countryside, and there's a great deal of palaver and contact between the truckers and the commercial sex workers, and Beira is a kind of vortex, a kind of vector for the virus. And I did what I often do as I travel. I visited the General Hospital, the Beira General Hospital, a terribly ramshackle affair. And I went up to the adult women's ward. 54 beds on the ward. 80 to 90 women patients in the ward. Almost all of them with AIDS-related illnesses. The ward echoing with that low guttural cough symptomatic of tuberculosis. Because the co-infection between tuberculosis and AIDS is now everywhere evident. Indeed, tuberculosis is the greatest single killer of people with AIDS in Africa. They were lying on the concrete floor of the corridor. They were lying on the concrete floor between the beds. They were lying on the concrete floor under the beds. They were lying 2 and 3 to a bed. There was such a congestion of anguish and death, many of the families were there, that I stood at the door of that ward and I thought to myself, the world has gone mad. Sometimes I think I'm gone mad. Sometimes I think I have absorbed a degree of emotional instability which is palpable to audiences who have to deal with my spasms of rhetorical abuse. I can't get over it. I don't understand it. I look at a ward like that and I think to myself, why are we losing all of these lives? All these women were in their 20s and 30s. We have the drugs. We have the capacity to turn this pandemic around. How does it continue? How does this happen? And then on top of everything else, you have the predicament and the situation of the children. The children are abandoned in this pandemic, have been at least until now, when more recently and suddenly UNICEF has begun to intercede, but for so many years the children were simply the addenda of the virus. So you have over 2 million children who are living with the virus now. 720,000 of them require treatment tomorrow morning to stay alive. Less than 5%, fewer than 5% are receiving that treatment, or roughly 5% as a maximum. 50% of them will die before the age of 2. 80% of them die before the age of 5. You know how they become infected? They become infected overwhelmingly in the birthing process, when the virus is transmitted from mother to child. But it need not be. There is a wonder drug called nevirapine, which when given to the mother, 1 tablet during the course of giving birth, and the liquid equivalent of syrup to the child, the infant, the newly born infant, within 72 hours of being born, you can cut the transmission by over 50%. So instead of hundreds of thousands of kids being born HIV positive, destined to an early and excruciating death, they're born HIV negative. Only 9% of all the HIV positive pregnant women in Africa even have access to the drug nevirapine. How is that possible? 25 years into the pandemic. And of course, on top of absolutely everything else, we have the orphans. Millions of orphan children. Somewhere around 14 or 15 million orphans now in sub-Saharan Africa, expected to rise to 18 to 20 million by the year 2010. These kids are so bewildered. They feel so abandoned. Everything is so inexplicable. Their situation is so compromised. We just haven't had this kind of historical experience, again, around children. I can't tell you how many huts I have visited where you have the spectral, emaciated figure of the mother lying on the floor in agony in the final throes of AIDS, and her children rushing around frantically, trying to find an aspirin for an opportunistic infection or a cloth to mop the mother's brow, however gently, and then they line up around the walls and they watch their mother die. And the trauma for the child is so intense that it's very difficult to convey in words. And because the communities, although they try so extraordinarily hard, are terribly impoverished and find it difficult to absorb the numbers of orphan children, many countries with over 1 million orphan children, many countries with 10 to 15% of their population who will be orphans by the year 2010. What was it, recently that the United States reached 300 million and there was much to do and excitement about it? Try to imagine, if you will, between 30 and 45 million orphans in the United States. How would you deal with it? You're the richest society on the face of the earth. How would you deal with it? These are countries that have these proportions, not 10 or 15% of the child population, but 10 or 15% of the total population. And these orphan kids are so desperate for nurture and love and affection and so bewildered by what's happened to them, and stepping into the breach in the absence of an adequate community response, because after a while the community is fraying at the edges, the extended family is gone, in steps the grandmothers. The grandmothers, the unsung heroes of the continent. Do you know that in a number of countries in southern Africa, 40 to 60% of the orphan children are being looked after by the grandmothers? As I said, there has never been a historical precedent for this. The grandmothers, think of it for a moment, the grandmothers bury their adult children. They're completely traumatized by that. Then in the age of 50, 60, 70, they start parenting again. They look after their orphan grandchildren, equally traumatized. Trauma meets trauma. It's like a redefinition of the human family. It's like a reconstellation, a reconfiguration of the way in which families are modeled. Millions of grandmothers looking after millions of orphan children. As long as you can search back through human history, even the Black Death of the 14th century, there is no analogy for this. No one knows what's going to happen down the road. What happens to all these orphan kids when they grow up, as many of them are? The pandemic's been going on for 25 years. They're starting to have children of their own without any parenting experience. And the grandmothers, bless them, live with that constant subterranean anxiety about what happens to my orphan grandchildren when I die. They end up usually in child-headed households where the oldest sibling in the family looks after the youngest siblings. I've seen many a child-headed household headed by a child of 8 or 9 or 10. It's a most extraordinary thing that is occurring in this world. And the world is only now quickening in its response. And although the epicenter is necessarily Africa, it's rooted in China, it's rooted in India, it's rooted in Russia. Indeed, Russia is experiencing an exponential increase in the number of cases, which eventually spread to Central Asia and to Belarus and Ukraine. There are very significant pockets in the Caribbean and in Central America. I was reading again this morning how the numbers are going up surprisingly rapidly in Indonesia, a Muslim population. People thought that Muslim countries would be less given to increasing prevalence rates because of the nature of the society. It looks as though that may have been an unworthy assumption. So we're facing a kind of apocalyptic moment which requires the intense engagement of the entire world. And there are glimpses of hope and movement, of course. I don't want to pretend otherwise. And I should enumerate them as if not as fully, at least equally to the enumeration of the decimation, which is easier to do because it overwhelms you so extraordinarily when you travel. Treatment is being rolled out. That's number one. It began with the World Health Organization pronouncing at the end of 2003 that it wanted to put 3 million people into treatment by the end of 2005. It was called the 3x5 campaign, and they failed. They didn't make it. But they unleashed a momentum which is irreversible. And all of the countries are now trying to put their people into treatment. There are about 1 million people in treatment now in Africa. Probably 4.5 to 5 million need treatment. So we will lose many more lives before we get to them, which is appalling, which drives me to distraction. All this needless death. What in heaven's name is it about Africa which leads to this reality? I mean, in 100 days between April the 6th, 1994 and early July, 800,000 people were slaughtered in the genocide in Rwanda in the full light of the world, and the world raised not a finger. And for 4 years, we know what's been happening in Darfur. Everyone knows. Your own government has declared it a genocide. And the world watches it unfold. And 2 days ago, President Bashir al-Bashir of Sudan, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most evil governments on the face of the planet, President al-Bashir announces to the world that he will accept no United Nations troops, no NATO troops on his soil, and the Janjaweed militias, funded by the government of Sudan, continue to rape and murder in a fashion which is so indiscriminate and so evil, so crude, so brutal, that there are very few analogies in the modern day to what is happening in Darfur. No one is willing to intercede. You're a serious group of academic students. I should point out to you that last year at the United Nations, the entire United Nations community embraced a new principle which had never been embraced before, called the responsibility to protect. It was a principle which emerged subsequent to Rwanda, which says, if I may paraphrase simply, that when a country is unable to guarantee the human rights of its own citizens, when there are egregious human rights violations in a country and the country can do nothing to protect its citizens, the world has the responsibility to protect, which can be manifest in economic sanctions or in diplomatic activity or in military intervention. And despite all of that being embraced as a series of principles by the world, no one raises a finger. I have to tell you that one would have to be impervious to human reality if you didn't understand that there was a subterranean racism at work here. There's no other way to explain what's going on around the pandemic. There is an indifference, there is an insensitivity, there is a willingness to write off Africa because it no longer has any geopolitical presence in the world, it's not needed. There are all kinds of wild canards about corruption and the nature of the African societies. But I have to say that there's something else at work, because why do you find expendable millions of people? What is this all about? And most of them, women, young women. So the idea of having treatment and at least keeping people alive is a significant glimmer of hope which has to be nurtured, and the rollout of treatment has to be much more vigorous. The second thing which is equally encouraging is what the Clinton Foundation has been doing. I have tremendous regard for the Clinton Foundation. I can't get over the way they have moved on to the continent, and they move with such urgency and emergency. If I have a problem around something in Africa related to the pandemic, I do not go to the United Nations, because I'll probably be in my grave before they respond. I go to the Clinton Foundation, and they respond with extraordinary speed. They take it seriously. And one of the important things that President Clinton did and is doing is negotiating the drug prices down. Drugs that cost several $1,000s per person per year, first-line drugs, triple combination therapy, 3 drugs in 1 pill which keep people alive. The price has been reduced to between $100 and $130 per person per year. It's astonishing. And now they're working on the second-line drugs, which are needed for people who experience resistance to the first-line drugs. Number 3, there are a number of preventive technologies emerging. A tremendous effort to discover a vaccine. In my own country of Canada, yesterday, Bill Gates visited Canada and solemnly signed an agreement with the Prime Minister of Canada to create a vaccine initiative in Canada. The Canadian government's putting in $111 million. The Gates Foundation is putting in $28 million. And they're going to establish a major resource center for vaccine trials. And the Gates Foundation and others have really thrown themselves behind the need to find a cure, because everything else is simply a kind of palliative. There has recently been discovered, just out this week in the recent issue of Nature magazine, a possible molecular relationship between a potential vaccine ingredient and the molecule and protein with which the virus deals. The virus has been able to outwit all of the scientific efforts of a vaccine up until now. Every time we think we're on the verge, the virus manipulates the activity and mutates into another form, and the scientists are dethroned. But in this case, it looks as though there's been a very important discovery. Still, everyone says a vaccine is 10 years old. Then there's the microbicide search. Microbicide being a cream or a gel or a foam vaginally applied by the woman, which can prevent transmission of the virus. There is a very significant effort being made to develop an intravaginal ring which can discharge medication over a period of roughly 3 months, so you don't have to plan for every sexual encounter. And the work on a microbicide continues apace. There was one recent setback, but there are still 3 major products in the pipeline of microbicide scientific development which are being tested in various phases now in Africa, and there is some real hope that in 5 or 6 years we will have a microbicide. And then there is the question of circumcision. It's really quite fascinating that there are now 3 studies, one from South Africa which emerged in July of last year, and one from Kenya and Uganda which emerged in the last 2 months, which suggests that for men who are circumcised, the transmission rate for the men is reduced by up to 70%. Indeed, every single one of the studies was terminated early so that the control group could have access to circumcision, since in fact it was clearly a factor in reducing transmission. There is now a study in Uganda to find out whether there is a similar reduction for women in the presence of circumcised men. And next month, the World Health Organization is meeting to take a look at guidelines for circumcision to be performed in medically appropriate facilities and surgical environments. And we will learn all of that in the world. They're late, they're always late. They should have been doing it a year and a half ago. I don't understand why everything is late. I was in Brazil when the study was promulgated in July of last year at a scientific conference in Brazil. That was exactly the moment when the World Health Organization should have got together and worked out guidelines anticipating that the study would be corroborated. It didn't happen. It's important that these things happen instantaneously. Every day that goes by, we lose more lives. I don't understand the sanguine passivity with which the world greets all of this. I told the World's Aid Conference in Toronto in August that I had been in the copper belt in Zambia, in the town of Ndola, speaking to the district health commissioner and his staff about the pandemic and what they were doing, because they have big mining communities emerging, which puts the miners at risk. And the staff suddenly said to me with great pride that in their area of Ndola they had very low prevalence rates because their ethnic group was circumcised. And in the surrounding ethnic groups who were uncircumcised, the prevalence rates were much higher. So I felt it was absolutely an appropriate moment for me to reveal that I was circumcised. And I tell you that because there then was an extraordinary orgy of male bonding, the like of which I have never seen approximated before. I've never had so much hugging and embracing in a short period of time in my adult life. And it demonstrates the power of circumcision in ways that are yet to be fully understood. There are numbers of extraordinary organizations in Africa now, like Doctors Without Borders. What a wonderful group that is. Partners in Health, Paul Farmer and Jim Kim at Harvard, who are now in Haiti, Russia, Peru, Rwanda, Lesotho, Malawi. Extraordinary outfits. If you really, maybe you've had Paul Farmer as a lecturer already in this series, but if you really want to have exposure to people who are moving the human condition, either Paul Farmer or Jim Kim can do that for you. And what is beautiful about MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Partners in Health is that they work with the governments. They don't impose views. They train, they provide treatment, they integrate the healthcare, they do everything with the government's priorities. And governments have to be respected. You can't have neo-colonial behavior in this situation. All right, I'm wending my way to the finale for those of you who are having quiet cardiac arrest and the necessity of endurance. I've told many an audience that I'm in a very Castro-like phase. If you'd like to go out for a cup of coffee and come back in, I'll still be speaking. The Achilles heel in all of this is the question of resources. And the Achilles heel in resources is the behavior of the G8 countries and the Western world. We are constantly betraying the promises we make. At the huge G8 conference in Gleneagle, Scotland in July of 2005, when huge commitments were made to Africa, even now those commitments are falling apart and absolutely everybody understands that to be true. The numbers of countries whose debts were to be forgiven are smaller than anyone anticipated. The foreign aid dollars will not emerge as committed. Everybody recognizes that. Even Tony Blair has admitted it publicly. And the international trading regimen was supposed to be reformed so as to build the economic strength of Africa. That has fallen apart completely, never to be resuscitated. There is a Pavlovian instinct on the part of the Western world always to betray the promises it makes to the continent of Africa with a regularity which is positively supernatural and can be relied upon in every instance. It's like the behavior of the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, who did such astonishing damage to the social sectors in Africa during the period of so-called structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s. There is no penance that they can pay sufficient to repair the damage which was done to Africa in economic terms during that period, from which the continent has still not recovered. Millions of kids can't go to school today in Africa because of school fees, in countries which never had fees before. but which were imposed by the World Bank as a condition for the extending of a loan. You want the loan, they said, you apply user fees. That's our econometric dialectic. And so the countries suddenly apply user fees for health and for education. And then the World Bank says, as it always does 10 years later, we were wrong. That was a mistake in judgment. It was a piece of economic analysis that should never have been applied. Structural adjustment is dead, quote unquote. And the consequences, of course, linger on. We've got to break the back of this pandemic. It has to be broken with the sustainability of resources. And the disproportionate nature of human priorities, the distortion of human priorities is what is so inconceivable. The Congressional Research Service of the United States of America, 3 to 4 months ago, published a study on American expenditure in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it turns out, as all of you must surely know, that the United States of America is spending $8 billion a month to fight the war in Iraq, and $1.5 billion a month to fight the war in Afghanistan. And that does not include the United Kingdom's contribution in Iraq and the NATO contribution, Canada included, in Afghanistan, which means we're spending over $10 billion a month internationally to sustain 2 conflicts. And we have never spent that amount of money in 1 year to combat a pandemic which has taken 25 million lives and has 40 million people in its grip. This is a Catholic university, rooted in certain principles of social justice, certain biblical testaments which are supposed to suffuse decent and compassionate human behavior. And you tell me what has happened to the moral compass of this world. You tell me how you balance those absurd extremes. If a government wants to fund a war, that's the government's right. I may disagree with it to my heart, and I do, but it doesn't matter. A government has the right to spend money on conflict if it wants to. But why so much money on conflicts and so little money for the human condition? What is that all about? And then when politicians fail, the celebrities move in. Gilmore and Bono and Oprah and Richard Gere and Madonna and Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt and Alicia Keys. Wonderful people who raise consciousness. You see, they fill the vacuum. In the absence of political leadership, we have celebrity leadership. But even though they raise awareness, they don't have the resources to make the changes. That has to be done by governments. So when governments fail to deliver on the commitments they have made internationally, it's necessary for the publics to respond. And that's how I'd like to bring this to a conclusion. This is a particularly fascinating constellation of people here. I wanted to come and speak to you because the MPS program in this university, in DePaul, is a program which puts a great deal of emphasis, as I understand it, on nonprofits and on NGOs. So many of you are preparing for a knowledge of the world which intervenes when all else fails, when governmental angels fear to tread. And the contribution you can make is infinite. These countries need human capacity. They need training. They need administrative capacity. There's nothing better than to twin with a university in Africa and provide them however a modicum of support as can be provided. The numbers of you who have already traveled to various countries in the developing world, you will know firsthand the extraordinary impact it has on you, your psyche, your future views of your own lives, but also the tremendous contribution that can be made in a short period of time with very limited resources. And there are terrific NGOs, whether it's Save the Children, or CARE, or World Vision, or Doctors Without Borders, or Oxfam, or Catholic Relief, There are so many organizations with which you can be associated to make a major contribution. I beg you to consider it. I've always believed that when one part of the human family is under siege, the privileged part, our part, of the human family responds. There is nothing more noble than the fight for social justice and equality. It's quite something to be part of that struggle. And I salute you for your willingness to entertain it. Thank you for having me.